I will hand you over to Professor Melissa Lane for tonight's lecture, Lawgivers in Modern Revolutions.
A very warm thanks to Michelle Gurney for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here in person or online. So on January 30th, 1649, the King of Great Britain and Ireland, Charles, who would become Charles I, lost his head upon the scaffold. Killing a king would become symbolic of modern revolutions. We think also of Louis XVI, the King of France, who would be guillotined in January 1793. Now, of course, not all revolutions have involved regicide. The one that began in the British colonies in North America in 1775 to 6 came and went without the death of the British monarch, who remained safely enthroned here in London. And the Iranian Revolution resulted in the Shah fleeing into exile in January 1979. But nevertheless, overthrowing a ruler, most dramatically through execution, has become emblematic of what modern political revolutions have come to mean. So modern revolutions are easy to picture, as in this way, but they're much harder fully to understand. So think of the very word revolution. The ancient Greeks had one way of referring to radical political change as to make something new. But to their minds, this was pretty much always a bad idea. What was good in their eyes was generally what was stable and long-lasting. And as astronomical study developed, the idea of a revolution came to be used to refer to a cycle of rotation, not a breakout trajectory to something new, but rather a return again and again back to the same starting point. So it was in modernity, and especially in response to the French Revolution, that the word acquired the widespread significance of bringing in something radically new under the sun, though, of course, the word would then be retrospectively applied to the earlier revolutions about which I'm also speaking. So a modern political revolution came to signify, broadly speaking, a popular uprising, throwing out an old order, perhaps through regicide, so as to make a forward-looking break with the past, lay down a new set of constitutional laws, and block any return. But when we look at actual cases, we find that each element of that statement has to be complicated. So popular uprisings don't exclude roles for individuals in inspiring and leading them. Forward-looking revolutionaries don't just reject past models, they almost always invoke them. And constitutional law giving doesn't rule out inherited laws, customary or divine on the one hand, or new everyday regulations on the other. So each of these three dynamics between the people and the individual, between the future and the past, and between constitutions and other kinds of laws and rules shaped all of the revolutions that I named at the outset. So these are commonly referred to as the English Revolution from 1642, the American Revolution from 1776, or sometimes beginning in 1775, depending on the view that an historian takes, the French Revolution from 1789, and the Iranian Revolution, again emblematically dated to 1979, but arguably having begun already in 1978. So each of these shook the world. They introduced something significantly new, but they also engaged with models of laws and lawgivers, as well as other kinds of figures from the past. And for those who've been following this series of Gresham lectures that I've given this year, as the chair said, on lawgivers and political imaginations, you'll recognize cameo appearances tonight for the Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus, the Athenian lawgiver Solon, as well as the philosophers Plato, Machiavelli, and Rousseau. Some of them, we'll see, appeared everywhere, from London to Philadelphia to Paris to Tehran. Still, those revolutions might appear to be very different from one another. So here's just one apparent contradiction. One of the English revolutionaries whom I'll discuss declared that the foundation of all law lies in the people, by contrast with the foundation of law in the newly proclaimed Islamic Republic of Iran, which was declared to be the divinely revealed Sharia law. But that contrast, like many of the others, will prove to be more complicated than it might first seem. In fact, we'll see that a role for divine sovereignty animated many of those in 17th century revolution, as in 20th century Iran, while a role for popular consent to the political constitution would figure crucially in the course of the Iranian Revolution. Now, of course, I've given myself a very, very broad historical sweep and a huge, complicated canvas for this evening. So in moving chronologically from one revolution to the next, of course, my account of each will have to be quite selective and limited. And I'm just going to be able to choose one or two figures or episodes to highlight in each case. And I'm also not going to try to evaluate outcomes. I won't be judging any of the revolutions to have been a success or a failure, a good idea or a bad idea. Instead, I want to focus on understanding some of the originating ideas, some of the ideas that were expressed by those who either prepared the way for a given revolution or participated in it. And especially, I'll be interested in what role they saw for lawgivers in relating to each of those three dynamic relationships that I highlighted, between the role of peoples as a whole and the role of individuals, between futures and pasts, and between constitutions and the everyday. So let's start with the English Revolution. And for each revolution, I'll start by briefly putting up 2 slides of dates. There won't be a quiz at the end, but this is just to help you orient yourselves. I won't try to cover everything in either of these slides. For the English Revolution, I'm actually going to focus especially on the events in this slide. So in particular, the role of the Levelers in 1647 in the Putney debates, the execution of Charles I, and Oliver Cromwell's being established as Lord Protector. And as the revolution continued, it again is dated differently by different historians. Many end it at 1660 with the restoration of the monarchy, but of course then some years later to be followed by another revolution, the Glorious Revolution. So the English Revolution had many phases, multiple protagonists. And I want to begin by focusing on one group, the Levelers, whose participation in the Putney debates in 1647 involved the assertion of the claim that I quoted earlier, that the foundation of all law lies in the people, asserted by Thomas Rainsborough, who, like the other Leveler leaders, was one of the soldiers in the new model army who had taken up arms to defend the rights of Parliament against the king. Though even at this point in 1647, regicide was scarcely imagined. It was still 2 years away. Now, within the army, compared to their fellow army officers, and they were debating against another group of army officers at Putney, the Levelers were relative radicals, but they were still radical parliamentarians. So they were not trying to abolish the entire political structure of the British Isles at the time. Instead, they were locked in a struggle with more elitist fellow parliamentarians and soldiers about how inclusive and how accountable parliamentary government could be made to be and should be made to be. So the name levelers referred to their demand for a leveling of the franchise, so leveling out the property qualifications, which still obtained at the time. And the levelers wanted to abolish property qualifications to the point that almost all free men would be able to vote, even the poorest. So wealth per se should no longer be a factor in having the right to vote. Now, they did qualify that by still excluding beggars and servants, and for some apprentices, on the grounds that they were dependent on others, and didn't have the requisite, therefore, independence to be able to vote their own views as opposed to those of their masters. But they rejected the idea that merely being poor meant that you lacked the independence necessary to make up your own mind and deserve a voice in politics. And so the purpose of leveling the franchise was to reshape the voices that would be represented in Parliament so that in its future law-giving, the interests of the poor and unpropertied would be represented along those of the rich and well-endowed, who had hitherto dominated even in the House of Commons. Now, in claiming that the foundation of all law lies in the people, as we saw, Rainsborough was not arguing that all existing laws had to be abolished and remade through some new act of popular sovereignty. Rather, he and the levelers were harking back to constitutional laws of the past, what they called the ancient constitution that they believed had obtained before the Norman invasion. So in their eyes, that past model had already embodied popular consent. So what had to happen was that the Norman yoke should be lifted by the force of revolutionary action and the ancient constitution restored. So we see here a complex dynamic between the future and the past. Future-oriented fighting was necessary in part to resurrect constitutional laws that were rooted in the past of England, and also for many in biblical texts that were invoked differently by all parties to the revolution. So what wasn't needed was a new lawgiver to act ex nihilo, as it were, from nothing. But the levelers did claim that there was a need for some new laws that could protect the interests that the Constitution needed to express and defend. So some new laws would be passed, but they would be in line with the spirit of the ancient Constitution. And in advocating for these new laws, they especially focused, for example, in their agreement of the people that they were defending at Putney, on laws that could force and enforce accountability of office holders and of members of Parliament. So this included annual parliaments, annual term limits for MPs that would constrain office holders and force rotation in office, recall mechanisms, and the ostracism of corrupt officials from the political community. Now, where did these additional models, these new ideas, come from? Well, in fact, they weren't new ideas at all. They came from the levelers' appeal to a certain reading of ancient Greek and Roman polities, especially as portrayed in their reading of Machiavelli's discourses on Livy. And the levelers, in fact, many of them were educated at the grammar schools that already obtained and made free education available. And so they themselves read the ancient sources either in the original languages or in translation. And Machiavelli's work was already widely translated and available. So the levelers read Machiavelli, who was talking about ancient Roman history in this work, to emphasize the role of the common people in asserting their strength and curbing the pretensions and the potential tyranny of the elite. And so ancient Rome had used rotation in office and recall mechanisms to protect the people, as had many polities of ancient Greece. And remember that word ostracism, that came from ancient Athens as a mechanism to ostracize anyone who was voted to be a threat to the political community. So all of those mechanisms could defend the collective against potentially tyrannical individuals. Now, the levelers, of course, were only one group in the English Revolution, and indeed, their arguments largely lost out. There were other rival voices in the same revolution and afterwards who drew very different lessons from the ancient lawgivers and their history. So others, such as Algernon Sidney, argued that the virtue of those ancient republics didn't come primarily from the elevation of the role of the people, but rather from a balancing of the monarchy alongside aristocracy and democracy. And at Putney, the grandees who opposed the levelers appealed in a similar way for the retention of the monarchy, the House of Lords, and a property threshold for electors to the Commons. Now, once the king was executed in 1649, a role for monarchy was off the table, of course, until the Restoration. But Oliver Cromwell would be named Lord Protector of the Republic, and interestingly, that role was given to him in the first written constitution in Britain, the instrument of government. But Cromwell was not the lawgiver of that document. In fact, it was written by a handful of officers in the army that he led. And that small group, who never became household names, helped to make the revolution and to make the Constitution, even though it gave power to Cromwell as Lord Protector, whom many felt to be acting as king by another name. Indeed, even in the instrument of government, he continued to dispose of some of the royal prerogatives, such as the power to dissolve Parliament, which he exercised. As we move forward to the American Revolution, so we can move from towards the end of the English Revolution to the American Revolution and the founding of the Constitution, in a sense, we're moving forward in time, of course, to the 18th century. But again, in many ways, we're again moving back because the American revolutionaries would also be drawing on past models in a range of different ways. So that included, for example, going back to the constitutions and the charters of the various colonies that in some cases had been founded by the British long before the English Revolution. So, for example, as I'll come back to the timeline in a moment, in the Virginia colony, we saw already that this charter for the colony of Virginia, one scholar has said, granted voting privileges to all adult male inhabitants regardless of property. So way ahead of the levelers in that sense in the early 17th century. But of course, not crucially to the enslaved Africans who, at the time that this charter was given, were already being brought to Virginia by the use of violent force. Now, as we consider the timeline of the American Revolution, we also, of course, have to remember that polities existed on the North American continent long before these dates. And indeed, the American revolutionaries would draw on the Iroquois Confederacy and other models of Native American government. And in these actions, as we'll see, and here we have the timeline of the revolution from the revolutionary period proper to the founding of the Constitution and its defense. We'll see them also drawing on the Greek and Roman models, on Machiavelli, and indeed on the English revolutionaries themselves. Now, all of these past models then, from the North American indigenous peoples to the English colony charters to ancient Greece and Rome, all of them would be important for the American revolutionaries. But they also, crucially, took a critical attitude to these ancient models, and I'll focus here especially on the critical attitude that they took to the ancient Greek and Roman lawgivers. So one of the important features of the American Revolution is that they came not just to praise or bury these ancient models, but to rethink their work, and as we'll see, in some crucial ways, to modify it. So we see this already in 1776, at the very onset of the revolution, in a work written by John Adams, who was one of the revolutionary leaders. And Adams here is praising the mixed constitution of ancient Sparta as a model, praising its division between a Senate-like body, a popular assembly, and an executive. So for Adams in that work here, that's the model of the Spartan Constitution, what he really elevated was the role of the Senate. And when he himself came to write a constitution for the state of Massachusetts in 1780, which itself became a model for the federal constitution, he gave a very strong Senate as well as a strong executive. And this was something that he defended in this interesting work written in 1787, which is, notice the plural, it's a defense not of the Constitution of the United States, not of the new federal Constitution, but of the constitutions, plural. In this work, Adams was interested in the state constitutions, including the one he had written for Massachusetts, and articulated them in comparison to Sparta, Athens, Rome, Machiavelli, Sydney, and all of those names figure liberally in his writing in this work. So the crucial idea here was that the Senate should be elevated. It should be wise men who have long terms and represent a kind of wisdom and virtue, an aristocracy, as it were, even in the new American Republic. And he was inspired by the fact that in ancient Sparta and Rome, in fact, those in the Senate had served for life. Once they joined, they served for life. There were no term limits at all. Now, that emphasis on the Senate would carry over into the Philadelphia Constitution, the drafting of the new Constitution. So again, to remind you of the timeline, the revolution had ended with the adoption of a loose form of Articles of Confederation. But by 1787, it was felt that a more integrated form of federal union was needed. And so a constitutional convention was held, which issued the Constitution still in force today, although much amended. And what I want to focus on now is the defense of that Constitution, which was made in a series of articles written under a single pseudonym, and we'll talk about the pseudonym, Publius, written by these three men, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And they wrote this to defend the Constitution that they had participated in drafting and to persuade the voters in the different states to ratify it. So we can identify the authorship of some of the particular essays that they wrote, and some of the essays perhaps were written collectively, or we don't know for sure who wrote them. Now, like Adams, the Federalist Papers, the Federalist Publius, were in favor of a strong Senate. But they also argued that the new Constitution, the new federal Constitution, made a crucial change, a crucial innovation, an improvement to the models of those ancient laws and constitutions. And this was the idea of representation. So what Madison asserted in one of the Federalist Papers was that America can claim the merit of making the discovery of representation the basis of unmixed and extensive republics. Now, in another work, he said, well, the ancients did sort of know about representation, but they didn't use it in their legislatures to exclude the collective participation of the people. So in Athens and Sparta and Rome, the assembly in each case, the different popular assemblies, could be attended by any and all of the male citizens who chose to attend. That's not the case in the American Constitution. So they wanted to say, we have this new innovation, but we're still using it to achieve the purpose of a republic, which we shared with the ancients. And that is a government which derives all its powers from the body of the people and which is administered by persons holding offices for a limited period or during good behavior. Now, you can see there's some commonality with the levelers, right? There should be a limited term of office. The officials should have to have good behavior. But the Federalists and the Constitution did not go as far as the kind of radical accountability measures that the levelers had advocated. They wanted to achieve the same ends, but as it were, with more limited means. Now, the final thing I want to say about the American Revolution is to have a word about their pseudonym, the pseudonym used by these three authors when they were defending the Constitution. And as I mentioned, it's Publius, not Lycurgus, Solon, or Numa, which it might well have been. Now, Publius was almost certainly a reference to the Roman statesman Publius Valerius Publicola, who was an influential consul in the early years of the Roman Republic. So he was roughly a contemporary with the Athenian lawgiver Solon in the early 6th century BCE. And he did suggest some laws that were passed during his time in office, but he wasn't remembered primarily as a lawgiver. He was really a more general kind of hero, known for his military and civic virtues. And so I find it interesting that these three framers of the Constitution, in their pseudonym, didn't present themselves as Lycurgus or Solon. They didn't put themselves individually on a par with those ancient lawgivers. They wanted to say, we're serving the Republic rather than, as it were, solely kind of leading it or determining its laws. And yet they made one final interesting claim, which we'll see will resonate with the French, which is that their strong Senate in the new Constitution would have avoided the fatal mistake that the ancient Athenians made in executing Socrates. So, as the Federalist wrote, as Publius wrote, the strong Senate could have prevented the reproach that was leveled against the Athenians, that they decreed to Socrates, as it were, the hemlock on one day, and within a generation they repented and had raised a statue to Socrates some years later. So for these American founders, the Athenian lawgivers had failed to protect Athenian democracy from the sort of fatal error that the new American Constitution would be protected against. Now, as we move from the American Revolution to the French Revolution, I've been arguing that there was a relative reticence of the American framers simply to identify themselves with the ancient lawgivers. Sometimes they compared themselves, but they also knew that they were making some fundamental changes and taking a more critical perspective. But that critical distancing from the ancient models is less seen in the key protagonists of the French Revolution. So, of course, the French and other thinkers had been engaging in what they called a quarrel between the ancients and the moderns for several centuries. But by the 1770s, they had come to be fascinated with the ancient lawgivers as models for modern statesmen, and that would come to play a kind of direct and less critical role in the French Revolution. So we can see some of that as we move through the timeline to look at some of the early and even pre-revolutionary comparisons to the ancient lawgivers. But I'm going to be focusing as we move ahead, especially on this very early phase of the revolution. So the forming of the National Assembly, the tennis court oath, the abolition of feudal privileges, and the founding of the Constitution of 1791, of course, to be followed by many more events and important developments that we lack the time to consider. But the background here, again, is that even before the revolution, many statesmen, both of the 18th century and earlier, had been compared by different French authors and thinkers directly to Lycurgus and Solon, and indeed to Plato. And there were eulogy competitions, as one historian has documented, in which people competed to laud French statesmen with these comparisons. And indeed, once the revolution itself was underway, a 1791 eulogy competition would be devoted to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, comparing that author himself as a venerable lawgiver on the model of the ancients. So the point I want to make is that, again, there's this fascination with the individual figures and the idea that an individual could embody these kinds of virtues. But we also see a collectivity claiming these virtues and identifying themselves as a whole with the ancient lawgivers. So we see that especially in the formation of the National Assembly in June of 1789, where what was previously only 1/3 of the Estates General, the Third Estate, that the people which represented the people who were not nobles and of course not clergy, they declared themselves now members of the National Assembly as a whole. So the Third Estate became the National Assembly as a whole, and they swore the tennis court oath on the 20th of June in 1789, a scene which was famously painted by Jacques-Louis David to adorn the very hall in which the National Assembly would subsequently meet. Now, in this picture, the whole body of the assembly is being compared to the great ancient lawgivers. And there's an amazing comparison made by one writer at the time, not just to the first 6 or so names, which would be familiar to those who've been attending these lectures, including Draco, Solon of Athens, Lycurgus of Sparta, Numot of Rome, Zoroaster, whom I mentioned last time, the lawgiver of ancient Persia, but also Confucius, Alfred the Great, and names up to it, including these kings of the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths towards the end of the Western Roman Empire. So these lawgivers, these members of the National Assembly saw themselves fundamentally as lawgivers, and they saw their task as to write a new constitution. So as the scholar Keith Baker has put it, between revolution and constitution, there was at the beginning a fundamental link. But the project was bedeviled by the question, was the aim to reinstate a past constitution, to recreate it, as we saw that the levelers thought they were trying to do? Or was it to create one anew? So again, we see here that tension between the past and the future. So one of the crucial thinkers in the early phases of the revolution, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, would argue that the nation, as an idea, could not be bound by any previous past constitution. So he wrote in his work, What is the Third Estate? Not only is the nation not subject to a constitution, but it cannot. It must not be. Now, that did not mean that the nation could not give itself a constitution. But what it meant was that no constitution could claim ultimate authority to constrain the nation going forward. The nation could give itself a new constitution, and then it could give itself a new constitution again. Sovereignty rested not in any charter or idea of the past, but in what the people as a whole could now do. And again, what Baker has argued is that what this meant was that the conception of national sovereignty that was required to annihilate an old order held implications that could not be contained in defense of the new. So in writing that, what he means is that this very idea that the nation cannot be controlled by a constitution unleashed a dynamic in which constitution after constitution would sort of follow suit until ultimately the revolution consumed itself. And we started to see that dynamic already even in the attempt of the National Assembly to write the first of those constitutions, which would eventually be promulgated in 1791. And this is a picture of the people outside the National Assembly who were, as it were, calling their own informal assemblies, saying, you're in there, as it were, representing and incarnating our sovereignty, but we're out here telling you what we think you must be doing. And so already we see a kind of inside-outside collective individual dynamic underway. And fascinating to me is that argument unfolded with another argument about how to interpret ancient Athens. So one of the more radical deputies of the National Assembly made his arguments, again, in terms of the ancient Athenians, Spartans, and Romans. This is a paraphrase by this modern scholar. What this deputy, Jean-Baptiste Saul, was arguing was that, yes, the Athenians killed Socrates, but that was not something they did when they were acting as a legislative body. When they acted as a legislative body and gave themselves laws, acting as a collective lawgiver, they never made a mistake. The only mistake they made was when they were acting as judges, trying to act as a jury in the case of Socrates. So again, the French can avoid those ancient errors, but the more fundamental fact about the ancient peoples, to go back for a moment, was that they had gotten it right. And so the French were modeling themselves on that ancient constitution in that way. So what we see then is that this dynamic, again, between individual lawgivers and the general popular will, between the future and the past, between any one group and the sort of people imagined as a whole, would be an insoluble problem. Ultimately, it would never be possible to capture that in a stable constitution. And indeed, the man who would put an end ultimately to the First French Republic, Napoleon, would himself issue a new code of laws. So ironically, he himself acted as an individual lawgiver in putting an end to the revolution. And yet the failure of the revolution would be ascribed by later observers to its overindulgence in what has been called by historians the cult of the legislator. So Benjamin Constant would reflect in 1814 on what had gone wrong in the French Revolution, and he said it was plus de lycurgue, plus de numa. The problem with the revolution was too much lycurgus, too much numa, too many ancient lawgivers, and an inability to control the implications that they had unleashed. Now, I come finally to the Iranian Revolution. And again, just to look for a moment at the timeline, you can see that events of the revolution arguably begin in 1978 with a series of popular uprisings and protests against the Shah's regime. And then the proclamation of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 of the Islamic Republic, which involved a referendum and the drafting of a new constitution. And I'm going to return to those points later on. Now, the Iranian Revolution is often portrayed as embodying an ideology of absolute popular power, and fascinatingly, often portrayed as drawing that ideology from, in part, the philosophy of Plato. And as we'll see, in fact, important thinkers of the revolution before it and during it did, in fact, draw on Plato. And as a scholar of Plato, this is, of course, something that I find of particular interest. Now, some of you will know from my very first Gresham lecture last year in 2023, and perhaps from my publications, that I think that ascribing an absolutist position of political rule to Plato's Republic is a mistake. And it appears to me that the same is true of the political ideas that animated the Islamic Revolution. This is not an ideology of absolute political rulers. Though I speak on this point, as on many of these cases, without the same special expertise that I bring to my work on Greek philosophy. Now, it's certainly true that Platonic thought has been an important influence on Islamic thought, indeed, for centuries. And of course, Islamic thought has drawn on a wide range of different, both internal and external thinkers. But the label of absolutism oversimplifies those theories. In fact, I think that both in Plato and in Islamic ideas, there's an idea of guardianship, as we'll see. What's needed is someone to act as a guardian of laws, but that's different from wielding themselves absolute political power. In Plato's work, the laws themselves are to be inherited in a way comparable to Islamic Sharia law. Now, in fact, Platonic thought has been influential in Islamic theology and philosophy for more than a millennium. This is just one illustration of that thought, although this idea of al-Farabi portrays the lawgiver as someone who purveys law without usurping the divine role in ultimately giving that law. So that's similar to some of the ways that Moses was portrayed, as I've discussed earlier this spring. Indeed, early modern thinkers compared the Greek term for law with the Hebrew idea of law and the Islamic idea of law, and that comparison goes back very far. So I want to just emphasize briefly these three themes as I move to conclude: the inheritance of law, the role of guardianship, and the place of popular consent in the thinking of two of the figures who were important in laying the groundwork for the revolution, in the work of Ali Shariati, and then the ideas of Ruhollah Khomeini. So Shariati did not live to see the revolution. He was a sociologist of religion, a political activist who was subject to repeated political repression by the Shah's regime. And interestingly, he appealed directly in some of his writings to the figure of a lawgiver. But again, this was not the figure of a lawgiver who would replace the divine law, but rather, as, for example, he wrote in his work, Where Shall We Begin?, the lawgivers would be enlightened souls whose responsibility was to enlighten the masses and so help to transform them into subjects who would be able to achieve self-determination through politics. And one scholar, Arash Davari, has compared Shariati to the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in arguing for a lawgiver who must work through persuasion to help to inculcate a new set of shared values. And indeed, in his writings, I would also say that we can compare his writings to the work of Nietzsche. Some of you will remember that Nietzsche fashions a literary figure out of the ancient Iranian prophet Zarathustra. And Shariati invented a French professor whom he named Chandel to present his ideas in his work. And in both of them, the literary strategy is arguably that the reader can achieve a kind of self-determination, modeling the political self-determination for which he's arguing. Now, Shariati did not live again to see the Iranian Revolution, but in pre-revolutionary as well as post-revolutionary writings and actions, Ruhollah Khomeini had begun to develop similar ideas, and although also in some important ways different. Now, for Khomeini, Sharia is a divine law which is revealed, and so technically, as we'll see, there's no need for a human lawgiver. But at the same time, he argued that there was a need for popular consent to the new political constitution of the Islamic Republic. And remember that I highlighted in the timeline that a popular referendum was called to vote to change the constitution, and then an assembly of experts was convened, directly elected by the people, to write a new constitution. So in thinking about this, I was put in mind of the work of a different leveler, John Wildman, who argued that all government is in the free consent of the people, and the need for popular consent to the Constitution, though not technically to the law, was evident in the early phase of the Iranian Revolution. Now, moreover, while Khomeini argues that technically speaking, a parliament shouldn't make law, because again, all law in the fullest sense is inherited from the divine law. But he does say there's a role for parliament in what he called planning in his work, Islamic Government. And this would be in the case of how to implement Sharia law, but also making, as it were, laws, new regulations on topics not covered by revealed law. So he wrote, for example, that these laws could operate, and this is a paraphrase, to secure the well-being of the country if that was needed. And finally, we have the question of the position of a supreme leader. So this is where you might think that we find political absolutism. But again, I think appearances can be deceptive, because the supreme leader is not the executive president who was to be popularly elected. It is a more general and encompassing oversight office. And I was put in mind just of the term of the Lord Protector role of Cromwell. But crucially, again, Khomeini's idea of the guardian jurist, which was the model for the supreme leader in the Constitution, has been argued by another scholar to be ultimately the idea of a Platonic philosopher king, as well as drawing on ideas of guardianship in the theology of Shia Islam. Now, that might, again, sound absolutist. But again, if we understand Plato properly, I think we see that it was not, in fact, absolutist. Just as Plato's philosopher kings were embedded in a complex constitutional structure, so even the supreme leader does not have complete and absolute power, but operates within a structure alongside a parliament, a president, and many other offices, many of them elected. So, to conclude, we have seen that the idea of a modern political revolution in our four cases is not as simple or straightforward as it might first appear to be. While revolutionaries might seem to be sweeping out the past, They've actually been fascinated by past models, sometimes even by working within inherited laws and constitutions. And indeed, they can have roles for singular individuals as well as complex assemblies. So the Janus-faced figure of the lawgiver, both imparting revolutionary change and stabilizing it, whom I've been discussing throughout my series of lectures this year, turns out to symbolize many of the most profound challenges of modern politics. Thank you very much.